And certainly as a Christian, I believe they're quite fundamentally built into the fabric of existence, because human beings are made in the image of God and therefore have inherent dignity, and therefore basic respect should be given to them, and basic rights flow out of that. And historically, that's been very much where a lot of the ideas of human rights have come from. And so I think that's the other big interest for me, is that my sort of basic beliefs about the world drive me to a fascination with human rights and how do we protect them. And then the third thing is kind of, just sheer coincidence and sort of chance, as it were. I came to the bar thinking I really want to do this kind of work. But as our other two panelists, Dara and Alex, are finding out, when you start at the bar, you kind of have to just take whatever you get. You can make some calls to try and get yourself in the areas you like, but you also just have to see what happens. And I very fortunately got the chance very early on, I think in my first or second year at the bar, to start working on a big public inquiry, the Al-Swedi inquiry into allegations of abuse in Iraq. And that gave me the chance to start to do this kind of work. It was initially just part of a big team. I was doing fairly boring disclosure work and kind of basic tasks, but it gave me a kind of in. And from that, I've been able to build up a practice that does a lot of public law work, both public inquiries like that, so I'm working on one at the moment, but also sort of broadened into all sorts of other bits and pieces of public law and human rights work. So yeah, there you go. That's probably the three main reasons.
I guess I would have some quite similar reasons to Ali for why I have an interest in public law. I'm not sure if I can officially say that I am in practice in public law at the moment just yet. I'm certainly trying to get there. I think I'm in practice in anything and everything that comes my way, as I suggested earlier. But that does, to be honest, involve a little bit of public law. Not as much as I'd like, but we're getting there. Why am I interested in it? I suppose the first would chime with a lot of what Ali said first, and that's an academic interest in it. I came to a relatively unusual route to the bar, although seeing Alex on this panel, it's not as unusual on this panel in that regard, in that after my law degree, I ended up working in a different role for quite some time, doing a master's degree, and then going on to do a PhD degree. And that PhD is in the area of human rights law, which I found absolutely fascinating. So to give a bit more context there, the area that I was working in was I left university and I went into the Irish equivalent of Sandhurst to become an army officer. And I was given the opportunity while doing that to do a master's, and I did an LLM. And the dissertation that I did from my LLM was very much in the human rights area. And from that, the proposal for my PhD arose, and that's how I ended up doing that. I certainly didn't foresee myself doing a PhD, but it was something that really interested me. And that kind of, the intellectual aspect of human rights law. I mean, it's a relatively novel aspect of certainly English public law in the sense that Human Rights Act is 1998. And indeed in legal systems in general, if you think of the main human rights regional instrument that we were subject to in this country, and that's the European Convention, that's only around since 1951. And in the grand scheme of things, not a huge amount of time. And there's a lot of developments that have happened over that time that make it really, really intellectually stimulating and intellectually interesting. And I think that goes beyond human rights law into the public law space more generally, in that you may have gotten the impression from some commercial lawyers that commercial law is where, and chancery is where all the real intellectual heavyweight stuff is at. I don't agree, but I would say that, wouldn't I? But I do think when you look at developments in public law in judicial review, since cases like Annis Minnick and judicial review really took off after that sort of period, there's a lot of quite really fascinating and quite intellectually knotty questions that arise in the area of public law that can really, you can get your teeth into. So that's the first aspect. My second reason is a bit different to Ali's. I find the thing I always loved in law at undergraduate was the stuff that involved people. So if it was tort and there were cases that involved people doing, this or that, and what happened to them and why someone was liable and why they weren't, fantastic. If it was crime, if it was people committing crimes or people being victims of crimes. It was interesting because it was a human story. When it then got to stuff like company law, I couldn't keep myself awake. I really, really didn't like it. I shouldn't admit that. That's an awful thing to say. But I found the stuff that didn't have a human element, that was more sort of dry and dusty, I found quite dull. And I think with public law and human rights, it's all about people. With public law more broadly, it's people's relationship to the state and how the state exercises power over individuals. And then with human rights, it's even further in that regard. Similarly to Ali, I've been fortunate in Chambers in that I've gotten onto a public inquiry and I've seen some public law from that aspect. And as I said, the immigration stuff that I'm doing, I initially was doing stuff for the Home Office, and now I've managed to develop a practice in claimant immigration, a small practice in claimant immigration, doing stuff against the Home Office, which means I can go home feeling a lot better about myself most evenings. And I've just found it fascinating. Immigration law in particular, it's legally complex. There are human stories. There are things you need to learn and understand about people's countries of origin, about the situation there, about what is it about their case that makes it important. And it's intellectually stimulating, but also there's a human element that I find really, really rewarding when things go well. And I guess that's my interest. Sorry, I've gone on very, very long there. I beg your pardon.
So yeah, I think there are shades of the same answers of the other panelists in mine. I think the main reason I like public law and human rights law is because of what it can achieve. And ultimately, and I know this might sound strange coming from a barrister, I think law is inherently quite dull and tiresome and difficult. There are some good bits, and as with Alistair, for me, it's the policy, the politics, the human stories, but the law bit, that can be quite dire sometimes. And the main reason I wanted to practice law wasn't because I enjoy it, but it's because of what it can do. And every so often, and it won't happen every week, but every so often you'll get a win, and you'll stop someone getting deported, or you'll get someone the benefits they were entitled to, or you'll get someone the accommodation they need, and you'll have changed that person's life, perhaps fundamentally, certainly for the better, a little bit, and you did that. And as a barrister, even a very junior one like me, you can do that fairly consistently for your practice, and you can start counting the number of people's lives that you've changed, and that's deeply satisfying. Whereas if you've, for example, interpreted a contract in a different way, or just have a very commercial practice and it's basically commercial disputes all the time, I don't see how you can get the same feeling out of that. Although there are obviously other benefits to doing that kind of work, of course. But yeah, it's what you can achieve with public and human rights law that in many other areas of practice you just don't get that.
Thank you so much. That's great. They're really detailed answers. That's brilliant. So the second one we've got is just, could you describe an exciting case you've worked on, something that's really grabbed your attention over your years of working in the bar?
Sure, I can start again. I think probably the most exciting things I've worked on have been public inquiries, because they tend to be about an enormous sort of big issue of public interest and concern. And probably the most exciting one, I got a really sweet gig, frankly, working on the Litvinenko inquiry. I don't know if you remember that from a few years back. For those who don't know, do have a Google of it and read it up, because basically it's about the assassination of a former Russian agent who then came to the UK and lived here, was very critical of the Putin regime, and was poisoned. And he was poisoned with a radioactive substance called polonium, which is incredibly rare. And the thing that was exciting about it, frankly, was just that I think if you'd written the story of Alexander Litvinenko and tried to submit it to a publisher, they probably laughed you out of the office for being too ridiculous and overblown and making James Bond look like, a very sober, boring take on spy stories. But it was all true. And some of the stuff that you got to sort of hear about in that inquiry was just absolutely fascinating. So yeah, probably that one. And as I say, I got quite a sweet gig because I basically got a brief in that case that meant that apart from one complicated week where we had to do quite a lot of work, the rest of the time we just got to sit and listen to all this evidence being trotted out, and it was just fascinating.
I'm not sure I can quite compete with Alexander Litvinenko in that case. The case that sticks out in my mind more than anything is one of the first cases I did for claimants in immigration, and it was a chap who had been in the UK since he was 15, and he was sent here by his parents when he was 15, and he had made a life for himself, and he had started a relationship with a lady who had subsequently, she wasn't originally a British citizen, but had subsequently gotten British citizenship. And the problem was that he simply had arrived in the country without, through irregular routes, as we say. I don't really like the term illegal immigrant. He arrived irregularly and hadn't had status since he arrived. And the Home Office had for years been trying to deport him and hadn't served him with deportation notices, etc., etc. And this man and his partner, just, you know, really lovely couple. They were trying to start a family together, and it was just a really kind of heartwarming story. Legally, wasn't a particularly exciting case. You know, it was an Article 8 case. It was whatever, not particularly complex, not particularly interesting facts, but it was in the immigration tribunal, in the first tier tribunal. It's very rare that a judge will hand down a decision on the day. And usually the judge will say, I'm going to reserve my decision, and you'll get the decision in writing in a certain amount of time. And because this was my first one for a claimant, I had over-prepared this, as every junior barrister does. I had, you know, spent months, well, no, not quite. I'd spent days and days and days on something that now would maybe take me a day's work and would be reasonably straightforward. And I'd submitted my incredible skeleton argument with all these references to cases everywhere, and went through, and I was up against a senior Home Office presenting officer who was really quite unpleasant, and, you know, he was very dismissive of the chances of this case. He goes, oh, you know, there's another one of these sob story cases and stuff like this. And we went before the judge, and things went well for me on the day. And the judge at the end said, you know, Mr. Coffey, usually it's the case that we would reserve judgment, but today we don't need to do that. I'm going to allow the appeal. And my client was sitting in the back of the room, and he didn't quite understand what was going on. And when he heard allow the appeal, all I can figure is that he thought they meant allow the state to deport him, and he burst into tears. And I could hear this terrible sobbing and weeping in the back of the room. And we're going through the motions with the judge, and the judge said, Mr. Coffey, I think you better explain to your client what happened outside. So I took this gentleman outside with his wife, and I said, no, that's good. You've won. You have, you know, leave to remain now. And he sort of stopped crying for a split second and then started crying again, but it was sort of tears of joy. And he and his wife were just really sort of overwrought. And it was just the first case where, like Alex said earlier, you know, it feels like you've made a difference. And to me, that was really exciting. You know, the facts weren't particularly stunning. The law wasn't particularly complicated, but it made a difference to this couple. And, you know, hopefully they'll start a family together and they can be happy. And that was exciting to me.
That's an amazing story. That's so good. Home Office presenting officers can be a bit awful sometimes. But yeah, so one thing I would like to say, the thing with public and human rights law is it's all exciting. You know, if you're in a chambers with a mixed practice area, like I think we all are on this panel, you'll find that a bread and butter public law case for a junior barrister is far more interesting inherently than some of the stuff you'll find your junior colleagues are working on. And just in terms of, I've got one interesting case I can talk about. It's definitely not as heartwarming as the previous one, but it's quite interesting. So I think it's about a month ago now, we judicially reviewed some new secondary planning legislation that deregulates the planning system. And this legislation is sort of a flagship government reform, and they basically want to make it easier to build certain kinds of flats without planning permission. And what happens, it's called permitted development. And what these houses what these homes end up looking like are these tiny slum flats. The very first ones didn't even have, you didn't even need to put windows in them. And these are the kind of tiny flats that the councils will inevitably put homeless people in, for instance, because there's a lot of them, they're cheap, and there's nowhere else to put homeless people. So basically it's slums of the future, we say. So it was a crowd-funded case, and I was acting for this NGO called Rights Community Action, and we challenged these 3 bits of secondary legislation in the divisional court on 3 grounds: EU environmental grounds, which was very satisfying, public sector equality duty grounds, and public law consultation grounds. And every ground was trying to push the boundaries of the law just a little bit. So doing the pleadings was a lot of fun. And I think whatever happens, it's going to be interesting to see how the court grapples with some of these issues. One issue, for example, was that the government had promised to reconsult before implementing this quite significant change, and then coronavirus happened, and then they said, well, okay, coronavirus is a good enough excuse to resolve from an express promise. So it's, classic GCHQ type question, and the question is coronavirus a good enough reason to resolve from a promise, even though we said there's quite a tenuous link between the sort of economic stimulus of allowing developers to build what they want and the pandemic. So it'll be interesting to see how the court grapples with that. But I think it's a fairly modest asking the court to quash the government's flagship planning reforms. So I'm sure we'll win. But yeah, watch out for that one. It's going to be quite interesting when it comes out.
That's amazing, and a massive range of stories there, which is so intriguing to listen to as someone that's quite wanting to go into human rights law. So what are some of the biggest misconceptions about being a human rights lawyer or practicing public law?
I think the biggest misconception is that there's such a thing as a human rights lawyer. In that you don't really, that nobody really has a practice in human rights. What you do is you have a practice in a particular field or several fields, and you use human rights law as a means to try and achieve ends for your client. And so I think one thing I want to disabuse you all of is don't kind of go looking for a career in human rights law, unless, I think there are probably a very small number of jobs that are technically doing that. If you're writing human rights policy for a UN committee, for instance, or working for the European Council of Europe, then there might be a job that is specifically about that, but there are tiny numbers of them. Most of the time, people who are human rights lawyers are actually just lawyers doing the stuff that we're doing and various other things, and using human rights as a means of achieving what they try and do for their client.
Unfortunately, Ali stole my first answer in that I was going to say I was going to say something very, very similar. But fortunately, I have prepared a secondary answer. So I think the biggest, or one of the biggest misconceptions is that all human rights lawyers act against the state on behalf of the claimant. Because there is a very significant number of human rights lawyers who practice human rights who work for the state, and they work for the government departments, either advising them on how best to comply with their human rights obligations, or if the government don't listen to them, trying to defend them when they don't comply with their human rights obligations. In my view, that is an equally important role to being the out there claimant lawyer, swashbuckling and fighting the government at every port. If, as a lawyer, you can give government advice that means they don't act in such a way as it is going to violate someone's human rights or civil liberties or whatever it may be, I think that's just as important, that you can preemptively stop a government enacting a policy that's going to be problematic, or you can amend that policy through your advice or have some sort of influence. I've also heard it said that sometimes when you're in the glass house with the government, and sort of, this is a terrible mixed metaphor, so I apologize in advance. If you're in the glass house with the government and advising them on how best to reinforce the windows, they will listen to you better than if you're the guy outside throwing bricks at the glass house all the time. That probably made no sense. What I'm trying to say is that if you're advising the government on how best to comply with their things, you will have more cut through in relation to the people that are actually in decision-making positions, if they seem to think you're on their side. If you're saying, I understand, Home Secretary, that you want to do something absolutely awful, but I'm simply telling you that that will be reversed in the courts, so I advise you not to. That is likely to get more cut through than standing on the outside and going, Home Secretary, you've done something absolutely awful, we're going to sue you. So I think that's an important misconception, that it's not just claimant work that makes you a human rights lawyer. There's an equally important body of human rights lawyers that work on the other side.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. So the misconception that I'm going with, so I think it's a misconception that you rock up on the day, you give an amazing speech, and then change the judge's mind on the spot, and then you've won. Congratulations. I have actually seen that happen once, but that was only because the person on the other side, their pleadings were absolutely terrible, but they were a very, very good advocate. So the battle in public law and human rights law is often won on paper. And if you can get in a good pre-action protocol letter, for example, you can force a public authority's hand and you don't even need to go to court. So actually a lot of your best work, certainly a lot of my best work, hasn't been oral advocacy, and that's probably because I'm so junior. I'm not actually a very good oral advocate, but it's on paper. And a few times now, I've gone to the court or the tribunal all prepared. I've stood up ready to say my bit, and the judge has said, "Oh, I don't need to hear from you, Mr. Shattock." And your initial reaction is, "Oh, that's absolutely gutting because I've just prepared days for this." But the reason he doesn't need to hear from you is because you've already won on paper or got permission or whatever it is you've done. And the first time this happened was in the upper tribunal in Manchester. So as a pro bono case, I'd gone up to Manchester on the train and stayed overnight in this fairly grim hotel. And then I get to the hearing in the Manchester Civil Justice Centre with 4 bundles. And then the upper tribunal judge is like, "No, I don't need to hear from you." And so, on the one hand, it's like, oh, awful, but then you stop someone getting deported just by writing a good skeleton argument. So big misconception is that it's all about oral advocacy. I think it's as important, if not more important, to have a good argument on paper, because then you can avoid the need to even have to make oral submissions.
That's great. So a range of advice there and things to watch out for. So what are some of the challenges you face in your field of work?
Do you guys want to go first? I think it's a bit unfair if I always get the first shot.
Sure, I can take this one. So I think it's money, really, and the more public and human rights law you want to do, the less you have to be prepared to get paid. And I think if you want to be a full-time human rights claimant public lawyer, then you're going to need a very rich partner, because otherwise it's just not valuable to just do legal aid work. I mean, I enjoy doing legal aid work. I do a lot of it, especially compared to other people at my call-in chambers, but I couldn't do it full time. So I top up my claimant public law practice with local authority work, planning and environmental work, and as I said before, a little bit of property law. So you do have to think about that there are consequences to doing certain kinds of work, and I know other people at my level, because they do less public law work, they just inherently earn more. So you've just got to be prepared to accept that. And just on the planning and environmental law as well, you do have to be careful if you do want to do public law, because I think planning and environmental law in particular, it's quite similar to public law, but it pays a lot more. So there are a lot of planning QCs at Landmark, and I can't think of one of them who didn't start off as a public lawyer initially, but then you start doing a little bit more planning law and a little bit more planning law, and there's a mission creep, and then by the time you're a QC, you're not really doing much public or human rights law at all. But I suppose maybe I'll be saying something different in 10, 20 years time when I've got a mortgage and 3 kids or whatever. But I think that's the way it can go if you're not if your focus doesn't stay on a certain area.
So I think one of the biggest challenges in public law at my level of call is getting the work. I think it's getting it in. If you're in a set of chambers like mine, that a lot of the public law work is government work, you really need to be on one of the government's panels, the Attorney General's panels of counsel, in order to break into a lot of that public law work. And you're not able to apply for that until I think it's 2 years post-tenancy. So I have another year to go. There are junior panels that you can get on, and there's also other places you can get that work. And I think, as Alex demonstrates admirably, if you're willing to put yourself out there, there is work to do. It may not all be paid. It may be pro bono, and in order to break into things, I think you have to be willing to do a lot of pro bono work and a lot of work that you mightn't think is immediately what you want to do. But it's at this level of call, it's breaking into the area. You can be the most intellectually rigorous you can possibly want on areas of public law. You can know absolutely every single case that's happened since 1970, whatever, in the area that you want to get into. But it's just getting that work in, and it takes one case to break it. It takes the right place at the right time. So it's a challenge. It's not an insurmountable challenge, but I think it's something that people should certainly be aware of.
I think as someone who's now got a mortgage, 3 kids, and another one arriving hopefully in March, I can tell you, don't worry, it gets better. I do okay financially. Although certainly
Congratulations.
nearly as much as people who do other kinds of law. But I think the biggest challenge as you get a bit longer in the tooth is just keeping on top of it all. So it's a very fast moving area of law. And if you want to try and keep a bit of a breadth of practice, which to some extent is inevitable in public law because it covers many different areas anyway, but also because I think, certainly I've tried to, partly because I think it's more interesting and it makes you a better lawyer, just keeping on top of the developments in the law whilst managing a more and more busy practice and life is probably the biggest challenge for me now.
That's really informative. Yeah, congratulations on that. That's amazing. Could you maybe describe your typical week in your field and the kind of working lifestyle you have? In any order, whoever would like to answer first.
You go first, Derek.
Maybe I'll go first this time. First of all, congrats, Ali. I didn't realise. That's fantastic news. And perhaps the reason that you're finding it so difficult to stay on top of things is because there are 3 children in the house. Not having any children in the house, it's still difficult to stay on top of things. So maybe not. Can I describe a typical week in my field? The short answer is no. And that's simply because, certainly at my level, every week can be different. It sounds cliched, but things can really change. One week I could be doing an entire week on the public inquiry that I'm on. Another week I could have 5 of those 5 days in that week in court. It really varies. At a junior level where I am, things come into your diary and pop out of your diary really quite short notice. You could have a trial that's been in your diary, a fast track trial or whatever it is, it's been in your diary for some time, and it settles just beforehand. Again, going back to Alex with the point he made about things being won on paper, you can expect to have a JR permission hearing, or indeed a substantive JR hearing, and the Home Office will come back and say, well, no, actually, we're either going to accept that you're partially right and settle it by consent, or whatever they are, whatever they're going to do. So things can change quite dramatically, and no 2 weeks are really the same, which I think is a good thing. But yeah, I think it's very difficult to describe a typical week.
Yes, definitely. I think that's right. I think as civil lawyers generally, we do less court work than, say, criminal barristers. I know from criminal barrister friends, they're in court like wall to wall every single week. And you can get weeks like that at the civil bar, but sometimes you can go a week or 2 weeks and you never do any oral advocacy because you're just doing advisory work or pleadings. So it's a bit more laid back than that, and I think I prefer that personally, because while I do enjoy advocacy, it's nice to be able to think about it and have some time to do the research and do a skeleton argument rather than sort of just rock up on the day and wing it, as I assume criminal barristers may be forced to, unless they're working all the way through the night, which I think some of them probably are as well. But other than that, yeah, it's quite hard to say, and it's also quite hard to say even quite close to the next week what the next week's going to look like. Like often my diary only extends, apart from the odd bits and pieces, my diary often only extends about a week into the future. So what I'll be doing, say the week after next, I have absolutely no idea. I've got some stuff to do next week, but it's a bit of a blank. And then your clerks just basically, it's their job to fill your diary for you, and it always gets full, but you never quite know what it's going to look like.
Yeah, and I think all I would say is that it doesn't really change dramatically, in that my sort of life is still pretty unpredictable, and there's not really a typical week. And I do genuinely quite like that. I mean, it can be stressful at times, but it keeps it interesting. So I think probably the easiest thing is if I just describe what last week, this week, and next week look like, and that gives you a bit of an insight, subject to the massive caveat that it changes hugely all the time. I think generally I've generally been in court probably a couple of times a week on average over the course of my practice so far. So as Alex said, not the sort of wall-to-wall court hearings that someone in the criminal or family bar would be doing, but also a lot more than someone doing corporate or commercial or chancery law would do. So to give you an idea, so I'm currently up in Manchester working on the Manchester Arena bombing inquiry. I'm basically there Monday to Thursday at the moment for a few weeks. But I'm trying to sort out some other stuff around that. So last week, as part of my role with the Equality and Human Rights Commission, I had to do a press conference on Thursday to launch the anti-Semitism report into the Labour Party. So that took up a day. And then I'm also trying to do a couple of bits of advisory work in the evenings when I'm up here in Manchester and on a Friday. And then next week I was supposed to have a whistleblowing and discrimination case in the Employment Tribunal for 3 days, which I was going to have to prepare at some point. But it's just settled. So as Alex has said, you still don't really know what your diary is going to be like week in, week out. It's just gone, which frankly is a total godsend because I had no idea when I was actually going to do that work.
That's brilliant. Unpredictability then seems to be the general gist of that question. So just to remind people as well, as Julia has just done, you can ask questions for the panel that I will ask after our planned questions for now. But the next question is, how has COVID-19 affected your field? Has it increased any numbers, decreased the number of cases you've got?
I can start with this one. So once the pandemic hit, I think there was a pretty stark drop to start with because the courts didn't really know what was going on. So for the immigration cases all fell off. All of the planning work and environmental work fell off because the planning inspectorate basically refused to do anything for about a month. So for a while the courts were getting to grips with things, I think a lot of us were twiddling our thumbs a little bit, depending on our areas of practice. But after that, the courts started to pick up a bit. The county courts, I think, are still struggling a little bit. But the High Court has been very good in the transfer to digital. The Special Educational Needs Tribunal was really good at going to digital, and I think most of their hearings are digital now as a result of COVID. Just in terms of, I think the question talks about areas of expertise. A lot of cases do seem to have a COVID flavour now, and you see it. I mentioned one case I did where it popped up. Other cases, like especially during the pandemic, about trying to get people accommodation, that was really important when we didn't know the scale of this pandemic and you know how contagious it was. And I recall one case where it was an issue because there was a really vulnerable client who we needed to get accommodation and a taxi for. He was a guy who was on dialysis, and he was homeless guy, and he was about to be kicked out of a hospital because they needed more hospital beds because of COVID. But this guy was too weak to travel on hospital days, and he was homeless. So what's he going to do unless the council pay for accommodation? So I mean, I was up until 2 a.m. Drafting this urgent JR relief application to basically try and force the council, like, you need to give this guy accommodation now, otherwise it's going to be really serious. And I'm sure in the immigration context as well, lots of people are getting released from immigration detention, or were getting released due to both some of the conditions in immigration detention generally, but also the fact that you can't, once all the planes stopped, you can't meet the test for detaining people because you can't show that you can deport them in a reasonable period of time. So I think that it's on the one hand, the procedure was a bit tricky in terms of getting the courts up and running. They're up and running now. And secondly, a lot of cases do seem to be slightly related to COVID now. So it's definitely changed the factual situation, which has a knock-on effect on the kind of cases you get asked to do as a public and human rights lawyer.
That's a really comprehensive answer from Alex. I don't have a huge amount to add, other than to say I think one of the things that I've found is I've had to learn how to do hearings over video link, which that's something all of us have sort of now had to learn. It's fairly straightforward for applications or preliminary hearings, procedural stuff. But I've done I think 2 now actual witness handling trials. And that was a novel experience. So there's a bit of a steep learning curve for everyone involved. Just see if I'll try and answer a couple of the other questions that popped up in the chat. Alexi, I think I tried to answer that earlier. One of the things that I said is a big challenge is trying to keep on top of all the developments in public law. And I think that becomes more and more of a challenge as you go on, because the breadth of it is exciting and interesting, but it makes it difficult. That's the simple answer. In terms of issues prior to COVID, I think probably the biggest thing has been the consistent cuts to or failure to extend legal aid. That has been a constant problem for more than 15 years now, but certainly since the introduction of the LASPO Act in 2012, which cut legal aid out from quite a lot of things. And that is still something that causes real problems for representation and for being able to fund a practice at the public law bar.
So I think the only thing that I'd add in relation to how my sort of practice has changed a bit because of COVID-19, one other aspect of law that I do that I didn't really mention is I do a number of inquests. My chambers does a lot of medical law stuff as well as the public law side of things. An inquest is a nice kind of intersection between the public law aspect and the medical law aspect. And because of an awful lot of the time, inquests will involve medical witnesses, such as the treating clinicians or indeed expert witnesses in some instances, actually having witnesses available to come to the inquest during the pandemic was, in certain circumstances, it was fine. If you're talking about certain disciplines that don't really relate to a respiratory disease like COVID, yeah, it was fine. But in other instances, things have had to be delayed simply because there wasn't availability. So that's made things a bit difficult. And again, transitioning to things being done over Skype, all of these new platforms we've had to get used to, because no two courts seem to want to use the same video conferencing platform. You've got Skype for Business, and you've got Zoom, and you've got Teams, and you've got Blue Jeans, and if I keep listing things, I'll just go insane.
Yeah, they can go on.
Yeah.
BT
the only thing that's consistent through them all is that no one knows how to stop talking over each other and interrupting judges and interrupting witnesses, and no one has really figured out the etiquette for remote hearings just yet, which makes things kind of awkward.
The unsaid agreement there was brilliant as well.
It's always embarrassing when a High Court judge says you're on mute. Like, I'm also in my slippers.
It's not as embarrassing as the time I wasn't in this hearing, but someone told me about the High Court judge who went to the toilet in a break and left the sound on, and everyone heard it. Nice.
Grim.
It's definitely brought in new experiences in court then, for sure. So the last question I've got here that's not on the chat bar is just, what are some of your top tips for people wanting to get into working with human rights and in the public law sector?
I'm going to be cheeky and jump in first here. And I think the key is get involved with things like pro bono organizations. The free representation unit is excellent. You know, any of those sort of things you can do, whether you have a pro bono society at the university, but things that get you experience in both dealing with clients and, if you can, assisting people in court context. And I think FRU is good for stuff like that. I think, that's what I'd say. Try and get involved in something that both hones your skills as an advocate, but also helps people. You know, I think that looks good on an application.
Definitely. Yes. I should say that if you're thinking of applying for mini pupilages, I'm currently on the panel reviewing the mini pupillage applications for Landmark. And I should say we award as many points for non-law experience as law experience. So my tip is try and get some interesting experience, but it doesn't have to be law related. There are lots of people and I know a few of them, whose only interest is law. And while in some ways they may be excellent lawyers, I think the question the panel might be asking itself is, would I want to share a room with this person? You know, would I like to have a coffee with them or go out for a drink? And if the answer is no, then you might struggle a bit. So I certainly, when I'm going through CVs, it's a case of just finding interesting experiences that like sort of pop out, basically. So partly it's a formatting thing as well, because you've got to think someone's going to be reviewing 100 of these, but also try and do something that looks interesting, and try and, I suppose, not certainly don't lie or exaggerate, but there's a way you can present your experiences in a way that's interesting and sort of jumps out on the page. So yeah, try and get some interesting non-law experience, and try and think about how your CV comes across when you're when you're submitting it, because whoever's reviewing it has got a lot of these to review. So if you can make their life easier by putting all the good stuff in a place where you can easily spot it, then you're doing yourself a lot of favors.
I'd echo all of that, and I think that the other thing I would add is simply don't put all your eggs in the public law human rights basket. Find at least one other area of law, maybe a couple, that you find interesting, you are attracted to, and really get some experience and interest in that as well. And that's partly just because it's good to diversify and generally, but also because very practically, there is no barristers' chambers or solicitors' firm which only does pure public law. They will all do other things. So they'll do, for instance, our chambers does lots of, as Dara said, medical law, clinical negligence, and inquests. So you'll do both if you came to us. Other chambers, Landmark, as Alex said, lots of planning and environmental stuff and public law. Other chambers will do commercial law and public law, employment law and commercial and public law, and so on and so on. So find something else that you're interested in as well, and then you have a sort of dual track.
That's brilliant. So that's all of our prepared questions finished. So I think I'll just pop to the chat bar to see what we got here. I think there are 2 questions from Julia. Her first one is there equal representation within your workplace, or do you think that that is an issue within the bar?
Oh, sorry.
No, go
on. Well, I was going to say that I think it's getting better, but it's clearly an issue, and it's, I mean, I suppose the makeup of this panel might be one example, but there's definitely men are overrepresented at the bar, and white people are overrepresented at the bar. It tends to be now more at the senior end, and certainly I think recruitment practices have massively improved. There's a lot of training out there. Like, for example, at Landmark just last week, I went to some unconscious bias training that the chambers had paid for all barristers who wanted to do it, and I think that sort of thing is going on across the bar. So there's definitely there's a need for improvement, but there's also knowledge that there's a need for improvement as well. And I think if you look at the barristers' profiles on pretty much any chambers now, especially at the junior end, you'll see it's getting a lot more diverse. But there's a lot of work still to be done, I think, and I suppose all we can do is keep being aware of the issue, and keep trying to make things better from a diversity point of view.
Yeah, I think that's essentially right. I think things are a lot better than they were. I think really it is just a matter of time. As people come up through the ranks, it'll start to be a much more representative profession, and there's lots of great stuff being done to kind of make sure that work is still being done, and good people of all kinds of different backgrounds are applying and getting into the bar. I think certainly at our chambers, that's the general view. I think we're quite proud of the fact that we've got a very high number of female silks. We used to be the best ratio, which is still not brilliant. It's nowhere near 50-50, but it was the best ratio at the bar. I'm not sure if that's true anymore. But so the general trend is good. I think the one thing I'd say, the thing that worries me is that effects on just the financial viability of the junior bar is, I think, far more of a potential problem for ongoing diversity at the bar and representation than all the sort of good work that's being done to encourage people to apply and mentor people and all the rest of it. That's all great and good and necessary. But if it's just financially not viable for someone who doesn't have family money behind them to get going, that's going to be the biggest barrier. And sadly, I'm not sure maybe that's been given as much attention as it should.
Yeah, I think I'd completely agree with that. What I would say though is that there are financial supports there. I think anyone who comes, or anyone who doesn't come from a particularly wealthy background, I don't myself, who thinks, oh, I can't afford to do the bar course, or I can't afford to do this. Look into the options. Look into the scholarships that the Inns of Court provide, both for the GDL, so the conversion course, and for the bar professional training course. They were a lifesaver for me. I wouldn't have been able to do my bar course without the Inns support, and they are a lot more generous than you might think at first blush. So definitely research that. I don't think that's necessarily enough. I agree with what Alex and Ali has said, in that yes, we're getting there, but there's a lot more to do. It's just a question of how we manage to do that. There are some great organizations like the Sutton Trust who do a lot of work with our chambers, for instance, in outreach programs and things like that. And we definitely have an awareness that we need to do better, but things are slowly moving in the right direction. But we're certainly not as good as we could be.
Thank you for those answers. I was just going to ask the Alistair one specifically in the chat now. Yeah, it's yeah.
I'll need to go in a second. So I've seen there's one for me, so I can deal with that. All right. What's discrimination and equality law like, Annabelle? And are there links to human rights in this field of law? The short answer is yes, there are lots of links to human rights. And I'd really encourage you to get into it. It's a fascinating field. Worth knowing that it's still dominated probably by employment law. That's still where the vast majority of disputes on sort of discrimination issues come up. And so I think if you are interested in that field, it would really still be worth getting some good employment law knowledge and experience under your belt. Obviously, the Equality Act goes wider than that, covers services and public functions and premises as well. But there's much less litigation in those areas. It's more advisory. That might change, but just the sharp end is still employment. So that's probably the best steer I can give you on that. I'm afraid I'm going to have to disappear, but it's been lovely to meet you all. Can I wish you all the very best for the future? And also, I'm sure it's not been the most fun time being a student this year. We've been very conscious of every time I see it in the news, I've been thinking of you guys. So I hope you're coping all right. Keep at it, keep your spirits up. And I wish you the very, very best for a career in law.
Thank you so much for talking to us. You've been brilliant, very insightful into the area of law. Thank you. Hope to see you in a panel soon. Yeah. Okay, so just for time-wise, I'm going to combine a couple of the questions in the chat box together, and it's just about kind of like online advocacy and working from home, and any advice you have around that. Has it been difficult? That kind of thing.
I think with the working from home, if any of you guys have advice for me, I'd be very much appreciative. Living in London, I live in a reasonably small flat with my wife. She's actually working at the moment, so it's fine. So it's reasonably quiet. But the table that I'm sitting at right now, that I've been sitting at all day trying to work, will be the table that I will clear off and have my dinner at tonight. And I don't think that's a particularly good way to work. But there's nothing you can really do unless you earn an absolute fortune and have your own private study somewhere, which most of us don't at the junior end. And it's hard. It really is hard. And I'm sure you guys in relation to studying are finding it equally as hard. I love working from chambers because I have a separation between my work life and my home life. And when I come home, yes, while some evenings I'll have to do some work, sitting on the couch or whatever it might be. For the most part, I have work there, home here, but now it's all blended into one. And when I'm sitting on the couch watching absolute rubbish on television, my brief is sitting there on the table sort of saying, Dara, you could be working on me right now. Why are you wasting your time with our Yorkshire farm? And that's quite a difficult thing to. I've just exposed my secret television guilt there, but it is very good. But yeah, it's hard. It's really, really hard to get that work-life balance. And I think the thing is just to have that self-discipline. And I think it's the same for university work, for paid work, for whatever it is. It's tough, and you need to be disciplined and say, no, this is my downtime, because downtime is just as important as work time. If you don't take it, you will burn out, and that's no good to anyone. The second one was in relation to advice for online sort of court advocacy and that sort of thing. I think it's always important in advocacy in any event to take your time and leave pauses for either interruptions or to make sure someone has said everything they need to say or whatever they might do. Online, I think that's even more important, because you don't get the subtle ticks of body language that tells you someone has finished answering your question if you're cross-examining them, or you don't get the subtle ticks that the judge says, I've finished writing down your submissions in that point, you can move on to the next point. So it's a case of taking your time even more so and slowing things down and just being really, really attuned to what's being said or what's going on. I think a key thing, and it's a really practical point, I currently have all of you guys on like gallery view, so I can see a number of people at the same time. Because frankly, when I'm speaking, I don't like looking at just my own face in a massive screen, and I find it weird. However, if I'm doing something in court, I will have it on single person view. So all I see is the person who's speaking, so I can focus on them specifically. I think that's a very simple, practical tip, and it's probably personal preference more than anything. But I guess that's all I can do. But again, if any of you have tips on how better to deal with this Zoom never-ending nightmare of lockdown, please do let me know, because it's quite difficult.
Definitely. I don't have much to add. I definitely echo everything Dara said there. I suppose practical tips, if you're lucky enough to be able to get a monitor or a second screen, that can be really useful sometimes, especially if you're navigating different documents, and try and use different window views. Like I tend to have whatever video platform on one side of the screen, and then the other side of the screen some notes, and then a second screen will have like a PDF or something. But yeah, apart from that, I don't know. I mean, doing a full day digital hearing, it takes it out of you way more than being there in person, which in a way sounds a bit weird because you're doing it at home. But I think it's just staring at a screen and trying to pick up all those ticks that you can't easily get in a digital hearing, but you would get in person. It just makes it more difficult, and I think everyone's struggling. I mean, you guys are clearly struggling as well. I mean, my fiance is a management consultant, and she's working harder than she's ever worked, but just doing it at home. So I think it's a problem that everyone who works, be it a student or someone who's doing their job, it's difficult, and we just have to try our best to manage it. So I'd recommend this is possibly not advice that I take, but the only thing to do with good advice is to pass it on, because it's no use to you. Try and take regular breaks if you can, and maybe even if it's just get up and walk around the flat every hour or so. I am told that that's what you should be doing. Obviously, I don't spend 4 hours at my computer screen and then wonder why I've got backache or carpal tunnel syndrome. But try and avoid that. Don't make the mistakes that we make, and hopefully everything will be fine in the new year.
Yeah, hopefully it's all going to improve quickly, let's say. I've got 2 questions about Oxbridge degrees, actually. One directed towards Alex about whether landmark necessitates an Oxbridge degree in order to obtain a pupillage.
Yeah, certainly. No, it's really unfortunate that I'm sure you've looked on landmarks sort of barrister profiles that everyone seems to have an Oxbridge degree. I know of a few people who don't, but I find this infuriating, because I mark all the mini pupillages, for example, and I award the same amount of marks whether you've got a first from Oxbridge or anywhere else, because in my view, a first from one place is the same as a first from any other university. So I mean, to be fair, I do need to discuss this with other members of Chambers to make sure that this is a consistent approach. But that's the approach that our marking guideline has for mini pupillages. It's the same guidelines for getting on for tenancy. So I don't know. I mean, we've had someone recently who went to the Open University, one of our new tenants, and someone else who went to I think it was North Carolina University or something. But then that particular person got a LLM from somewhere in Oxford as well. So it's unfortunate, and the whole Oxbridge bias is something that a lot of organisations need to deal with. And I mean, when I used to work at the Law Commission, it was a problem. But what they did is that they made it university blind, and then you'd get more people from Oxbridge coming in because they get more opportunities, I think, which makes their CVs stand out, even though it doesn't have Oxford or Cambridge on it. So yeah, it is a problem. There's definitely no requirement, but I can't get away from the fact that at Landmark, we a lot of people who get on do seem to have degrees from Oxbridge, but there's no reason why that should be the case. And I think we need to have a conversation about that. But that's, you know, it's difficult, and I think that's true for a lot of chambers as well. It's just, and a lot of professions. I think Oxbridge is just overrepresented, which is infuriating for someone like me. Who did go to Oxbridge, but then I went to a comprehensive school. For example, my parents didn't go to university, so suddenly you get there, and then you're put in a, you know, you feel part of the problem after a while. But I'm not sure what the solution is to that, Dara. I don't know.
Yeah, I would echo everything Alex has said in that regard. I think, like the points we've made on diversity, it's getting better slowly. It's certainly not the case anymore, and it's not been the case for a long time that you must have an Oxbridge degree. You know, someone will say, "Oh, you went to university, which one?" That's definitely not the case anymore. You know, it's there's a lot of people that I know in very, very good sets of chambers who don't have Oxbridge degrees and don't have Oxbridge masters either. So I think we'd be lying to you if we told you that it didn't make things easier to have one. I think the sad truth is that there's some chambers that still have that view. But I think there's a lot more chambers who are now moving towards either university blind or simply a marking scheme. I know Matrix, for instance, have a marking scheme whereby they say, if you have a first, you get this many points. It doesn't matter where the first is from. If you have a first, you get this many points. If you have a master's, you get this many points. Again, it's university blind. It doesn't matter where they are. I would hope more and more chambers will move that way. Currently, what I would say is that it is more important to have a good degree than an Oxbridge degree. And by good degree, I don't mean where it comes from. I mean a good classification. So a high 2-1 or a first, and realistically, to give yourself the very best opportunity, try and get that first. If you, for some reason, if something goes wrong and you don't manage to get a first or a high 2-1, you need to be aware that you will need to build your CV up some other way. That doesn't have to be a master's, because, you know, a lot of people that's not possible for whatever reason. But it needs to be work experience that shows that you have the skills to do this, and shows commitment, or it needs to be pro bono work or whatever it must be. But just be aware the degree, where it comes from, certainly not the be all and end all, but you will need to work that little bit harder. It's just the sad fact of the matter at the moment. I hope it changes soon, but yeah, a headline, not a necessity, but some people, it just requires, you know, a little bit of extra thought, a little bit of a different application.
Thank you for those honest answers. To end on a high note, is there any cons to working in public law compared to other areas of law? Lavanya says, sorry to seem negative, but she would genuinely like to know. So maybe some interesting points.
I think there's cons to working in every area of law. I think there's cons to every job that you're going to do. What you need to look for is that the pros outweigh the cons. When you lose a case as a public lawyer where you have, you know, someone's life involved, so if you lose a deportation appeal and someone is going to be deported, that's a lot harder than losing, you know, a small claim, personal injury coming from a road traffic accident or something like that. That's tough. You take that home and you think, what could I have done better, or was it my fault, or how could I have changed what I did to make the outcome? And no matter how many times someone says, you know, you couldn't have done anything, or you couldn't, you'll still beat yourself up over it. I don't think people go into this area of law if they're not going to beat themselves up over it a little bit. So that's a con. As Alex sort of said earlier, the money isn't as spectacularly big as it could be in commercial sets. It's not terrible, and we're doing, certainly in the public/civil law bar, we're doing a lot better than our criminal colleagues, who are really, really struggling at the moment. So we really shouldn't grumble. But by the same token, if we were in international arbitration or something like that, you know, I wouldn't be living in my small flat in South London. I'd be living in some palace somewhere. Well, no, it'd probably be still a small flat, but just to be a nicer part of London, maybe. So yeah, I guess money, taking things home with you. It's not a job that's 9 to 5. You're self-employed as a barrister, and this cuts across all areas of practice. Because you're self-employed, if you're working for yourself. So the temptation is always there to do that extra hour, do that extra bit of work here and there. I haven't had a full weekend to myself since I've started practicing at the bar. And that includes things when I go away for weekends. Usually there is some piece of work that comes with me. Even if that's simply, sending off this final email or proofreading this advice or whatever it is, the work is always there. I love what I do, so I don't really mind it. My wife, I certainly cannot say the same for. That it gets quite frustrating for her when I'm going, yeah, I just need to send this email. I'm really, really sorry. And it's something I need to get better at. I need to get better at drawing that line, but that is a con, that you can get so engrossed in your work that it can be a little bit all encompassing. But I think each of those cons, there are definitely strategies you can adopt. Well, maybe not with the money, but certainly with the taking things home and the working too much, the strategies you can adopt to minimize the negative effects.
Yeah, I think that's completely right, and it's important we don't sugarcoat it as well. I think at the bar the work-life balance isn't great, and it might be worse in some areas. It's probably better in some areas than public law, because a lot of public law is so urgent. Like, we need to get this, especially if there's like an urgent application for interim relief. You might be instructed at 4 p.m. and then they want to issue the next day because that's the last day before someone loses their home or gets deported or whatever. So there's a sense of urgency that comes with public law that makes it a bit more kind of sprinty, and means you have to do more lates. And yeah, just general working at the bar is a bit tricky. For example, this week is my week off, but I don't think there has been which my colleagues think I'm mad. I think I said no or batted away like 5 pieces of work last week because I wanted to keep this week free, and yet I've still done a little bit of work every single day. So if I'd actually done what the instinctive thing is when you're very junior, which is to say yes to everything, and thought, I can squeeze that in, I'd have just completely worked through this week. And I've managed to avoid that, but I'm still doing little bits of work here and there, because just urgent stuff just happens. This judgment has been handed down. You need to proofread this, or for example, it was yesterday, and because you have the responsibility for the case. If you don't do it, then it's not like you have a colleague who can take your emails when you're away, as you might get in a solicitor's firm. So that is a bit tricky, and that is definitely probably the key downside of the job. But there are benefits to that as well, because sometimes you can just say, actually, I'm going to get up at 11 a.m. this morning and walk into chambers at midday, and then leave at 4. And you'll probably end up, I tend to get in late quite a bit, but then I end up working quite late. So it definitely balances out. It's not like you're doing less work that way, but you get a kind of the illusion of freedom by not being required to get in at a certain time, or being able to take 2 hours for lunch if you want to. So there are some benefits to that, but overall, the amount of hours you do is definitely more than other jobs.
Yeah, just to reiterate what Alexi said, thank you for joining us on your week off, Alex. That's great of you to do. And there's just one question that shouldn't be too long from Annabelle is, do you look at A-level results for pupillages and mini pupillages? Are they important?
No, I don't think so. I don't think I've ever looked at them when looking for doing the mini pupillage reviews. And I'd be surprised if, I mean, for a start, I don't know what these new A-level results mean now. You get like an 8 or a 7 or something. I have no idea how that translates into, whether someone, or is that just GCSEs? Who knows? But no, I don't think that's important. So if you're worried about your A-levels, then don't, and definitely don't highlight them as your key achievement if they are really good, which I'm sure they are. But at this stage, definitely just focus on other things. Post-school achievements.
yeah, I've nothing further to add there.
Great. Thank you so much, Holly, for that. Thank you to our panelists for joining us today and for making it such an interesting and insightful panel. Thank you very much. We're also having another event on the 1st of December in collaboration with the Criminal Justice Society, and I will put the link in the chat box so you can RSVP us. Thank you all for coming. I hope you enjoyed it because I really did. Thank you so much. You're free to go now.
Thanks very much, and best of luck with everything. Hopefully the vaccine will be out next year and you'll be able to do twice as much partying and drinking because you missed out this time.
Let's hope.
Yeah, best of luck to everyone, and just to say well done to your committee for organising this. It was a fun event, so thank you for having me.
Thank you for dedicating your time. Have a great evening.
Bye, guys.
Bye all, see you.